Well, scientists are looking into whether post-COVID syndrome should be recognised as an illness after coronavirus sufferers reported debilitating symptoms for weeks or months after they'd recovered from the virus.
Yes, patients say they're experiencing fatigue, breathlessness and brain fog for longer than expected. So let's talk to Professor Rob Copeland, who's director of a new research centre. It's been set up to help support COVID sufferers. He is joined by one of his patients, Jeannie McGuinness. We can also talk to Callum O'Dwyer. Now, he's in Aberdeen. He's just 28 years old. He had coronavirus 3 months ago. And Callum, you are struggling to walk for even 5 minutes. We're going to talk to you about that in just a moment. In Cheshire, Peter Julian, who's also had coronavirus, believes he has post-intensive care syndrome, a form of PTSD. So, Callum, just tell us, you recovered from coronavirus, but you cannot operate fully functioning at the moment.
Yeah, that's correct. So I had the full gamut of COVID-like symptoms of fever, cough, and fatigue, nausea, other bits and pieces. And that lasted about 2 weeks or so. It was very intense. I had 2 quite serious bouts of shortness of breath that I had to call the hospital for, but I wasn't taken in. So I've had all my treatment at home, largely by rest. And after those initial 2 weeks, the fatigue, muscle weakness, brain fog, and then a recurring shortness of breath has left me. I was about 3 weeks living by myself in my flat, really unable to look after myself, really struggling, very debilitating. I was hardly able to cook or wash dishes or keep on top of bins. And in so doing, I had to actually leave that environment where I was by myself because I couldn't look after myself. And I'm currently living with my parents to be looked after, and that's me 3 months and 1 day after I first started.
You're only 28 years old. I mean, you're a young guy. You were fit. You used to do a lot of running, I think. So this is, a lot of people think this only hits elderly people or people with underlying health conditions. You were neither.
That's right, and it's been a massive shock. When I was, very unwell and I was hardly able to take in a breath, I was gasping, and that was incredibly scary. I thought that was me, that was going to be curtains. But then when I got through it and didn't need to go to the hospital and all that sort of thing, and I was on the mend, I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to, be back to work next week. It's going to be great. But the thing I want to really impress on people is that several times it's felt like the clouds have broken through. I'm starting to get better, but over and over again, it's put me back a few stages, and it's that cycle of I'm starting to get better, and then I fall back is so frustrating. Yeah. It's so difficult for people, and that's been my life for 3 months now.
I know, Callum, that doctors have told you that you're suffering from post-viral fatigue. There's this new centre been set up to look into this. I just want to, before we talk to the professor in charge, I just want to talk to Peter Julian about your experience. Now, you are 54, you don't smoke, no pre-existing health conditions. You spent 17 days in hospital. Unlike Callum, you were actually admitted to hospital, and 8 of those were on a ventilator, fighting for life. Now, you have a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, don't you, after being treated in intensive care? Just describe how that manifests itself.
Well, I think what I'm suffering from is actually mostly what anybody that's been on a ventilator or in intensive care suffers from. So it's everything Callum's just said. So right now, after 9 weeks out, I can walk 10 minutes before I get breathless on the flat. The worst thing is the cognitive problems. So my memory and my short-term and long-term memory is gone. I almost forgot that. Also, you really struggle to do cognitive tasks. So following an email, if I write an email or do anything like that, I probably have 25 minutes a day I can do that in before I'm worn out for the rest of the day. Wow. Following conversations is really hard. You get confused, and it gets worse through the day. So I start off fairly okay in the morning and then dip through the day. And there's been no proactive support whatsoever from, from my GPs. When I rang them about my care, I was simply told there was no care. So you're pretty much left to flounder on your own, I'm afraid.
We're getting a lot of reaction to this already. Some people here, I'm on week 14 with suspected COVID-19. Still feeling very rough. Julie on Twitter, I've got the cough, the fatigue, the aches, the breathlessness. A lot of people suffering these kind of aftermath symptoms for a long time. Professor Copeland, this does seem to be one of the many weird phenomena of this virus, is that you can have it even quite mildly, but the sort of aftershocks can go on for a long time and can be really quite unpleasant.
Yeah, sure. And I think what this has shone a light on is the fact that, the perception that either you have this virus really severely and you end up in hospital, or you recover immediately after 2 weeks is just not the case. We've seen thousands of people, and in fact the data from the COVID symptom study suggests there's hundreds of thousands of people for whom long-term symptoms persist. The chronic fatigue particularly is a key challenge, and the non-linear recovery that Callum talked about is perhaps one of the most interesting elements, because you feel like you're on the road to recovery, the symptoms appear to lift, and then you start to engage in your usual behaviour, maybe even go out and engage in some physical activity, and a couple of days later it can knock you back. And so for us at the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, that's really interesting to explore.
Yeah, and you're sitting next to one of your case studies, Jeannie McGuinness. Jeannie, you would have classed yourself as fit and healthy in the run-up to getting the virus, but you are now still suffering the effects 90 days on. Similarly to Callum, you contracted it early on in March, didn't you? What are your symptoms right now?
Well, I'm actually on day 104, and I mean, yesterday morning was a great example. I had done well for about 2 days, and then yesterday morning I woke up and I felt like I was breathing through a straw. My lungs had constricted. It impacted my voice. I mean, I had laryngitis for 11 weeks. And now I am on, almost up to week 16. And my story is similar to Callum. I never went to the hospital, though we did have paramedics because of the shortness of breath and this kind of COVID-induced asthma that happened, and this kind of waking up in the night where you feel like you have this strangle. They call it the COVID strangle, where you're gasping for breath. And that was my normal, for weeks and weeks. Though I talked to many GPs, I never did go to the hospital.
It's interesting. We're bringing in Hilary here because, Hilary, you and I have discussed, a lot of what these people are saying were quite similar to what I experienced, for example.
I know, when Jeannie's describing that breathlessness and asthma, that is what
last night I had a bad night again, which I put down to the pollen count. I put it all down to hay fever. I do wonder, I'm looking forward to having one of the antibody tests to see actually if I have had this, because
you
a lot of what,
negative, though.
Yeah, a lot of what they're saying is quite similar, particularly the breathlessness. What are you picking up, Hilary, about this?
Well, of course, there are false positives with the antigen tests, and there are lots of false negatives and positives with the antibody tests, so they're not completely reliable. What I would say, listening to those people, it's really interesting that GPs have already been written to say that about half of all patients who come out of intensive care after having COVID-19 suffer from some degree of cognitive, physical and psychological consequences. About half. So this isn't...
And would that be normal, Hilary? Would that be normal? If you come out of ICU, particularly if you've been on a ventilator, for any condition, would you normally expect that level of people to suffer that level of cognitive issue?
You could certainly expect it in a proportion of patients, but what's interesting about this particular virus is it's no different to other viruses. I mean, we talk about post-infectious Lyme disease, we talk about post-polio syndrome, we talk about myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue after glandular fever. So these are all long-term consequences of particular viruses. And it appears that COVID-19 is no different. So not only have you got the consequences of being ventilated and near death in intensive care, but you've got the effects of COVID-19, which is a multi-organ disease with inflammation of blood vessels in kidneys, in lungs, in the liver and in the brain. And it's perhaps no surprise that we see people with these kind of symptoms lasting a long time.